Imagine a place where the boundaries of age, industry, background, and culture melt away, replaced by a shared desire to explore the depths of our collective experiences. Here, on the open, shaded porch, amidst an atmosphere of serenity and tranquility, leaders from all walks of life gather to share their stories, the stories that shape their very beings and doings. This is the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Marouf.
Thank you for joining me for my very first podcast. Today's guest has transformed the healthcare sector in Lebanon and beyond. Richard Haykel is the chairman of Haykel Hospital, the largest and most advanced private hospital in North Lebanon. He's passionate about creating positive change in his community and inspiring others to do the same. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Laila, and thank you for having us. This is a great opportunity.
I'm so excited to learn so much from you, Richard, really. Let's start with a story of Haykel Hospital. What's the story behind the hospital?
It's actually quite an intriguing story. My parents had met in New York. My dad was born and raised in France. My mom was born and raised in Poland. She learned to be a nurse, and he was studying to be a doctor. And so he was doing his residency in New York. Well, she was the head nurse that was responsible for the whole hospital. That's how they got married. And then my grandfather, who was of Lebanese origins, had moved back to Lebanon. And when he moved back to Lebanon, being that my dad was the youngest one of his siblings, he was, let's say, gently bullied to move back and take care of his dad and his mom that were living in Lebanon. And when they did come back, they found that there was a need for a hospital in the north. They had worked in Beirut, and they didn't like it very much because there was a lot of dichotomy because, hospitals and doctors and fees and so on. So my dad had gone to my grandfather to say that he was going to move back to the States. My grandfather said, no, there's a need for healthcare institutions in the north. And so why not stay and build? They built it in 1967. It was finished in 1969. I was the second baby that was born in the hospital at the time. It was completely destroyed during the Civil War in 1975 because of the problems that were happening in the country. We had moved back to the States. My dad had decided to come back to Lebanon and rebuild the hospital in 1977. And that's what he did. The rest is pretty much history. I studied in the States. I went to undergraduate school in Boston. And when I graduated, my parents gave me an ultimatum. It's either I moved back to Lebanon. It was the same kind of bullying that happened 40 years prior to my dad. It's either I come back and I take care of the business, as it's called, or they would be thinking about leaving the country. My brother and sister had decided to stay in the States. They did not want to come back to Lebanon.
But you didn't. You decided to stay.
Yeah.
And you're still there.
Yeah.
I think this is an amazing story. It tells me so much about you. For me, Lebanon is always a symbol of beauty. It's a symbol. It's all those summers that we had there for many, many years. But I think for our listeners, maybe Lebanon is more like VUCA world in many ways, ever-changing, unexpected events, disruptions all the time. So how do you do it? How do you make it? How do you lead a hospital in situations like that? I think your insights would be greatly appreciated.
You mentioned the secret word. VUCA is basically the kind of atmosphere that we function in. And so in order to be able to do that, you need to have two driving principles in your business. First one is being highly adaptable, and the second one is being highly agile. So you need to be able to switch between different types of management and very quickly. So for example, in the financial department in the hospital, where we have lots of issues because today we don't even have a financial sector in Lebanon. Banks don't exist. So it's super interesting. We manage the financial aspect as a VUCA with scrums, adaptability. There's no such thing as a strategic goal that's 4 or 5 years down the road. It's basically about putting your foot on the pedal on a daily basis and managing your cash flows. While you look at nursing care, you cannot leave it up to people to innovate. Any mistake in a nurses giving care can lead to a catastrophic situation with a patient. So there you do the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's more of a military style. When she has to do an injection or she has to wash her hands, it has to be of a certain methodology. So that makes the whole establishment, the healthcare establishment, which has lots of moving parts. And how do you make those people speak the same language? And how do you make those people get along? It's another kit and caboodle, as they say in the States. But some work was done by Google in the past, and they came out with something called Aristotle. And what they had found was that the biggest problem was communication. The middle and front key personnel don't communicate with each other very well. And so we took that learning from them, and we started these different departments speak with each other, although they were run in very different managements.
Yes.
And when you see them creating ownership and leading the departments and talking together in the morning and talking together on all the kinds of different chat groups, it makes you very happy and very proud. The issue is, I'm sorry if I'm taking too long, but I warned you with the.
No, I really love to hear that. You know why? Because it's so much aligned with the principles of knowledge mindfulness. But I think where I look, it's the lens of knowledge mindfulness while you're talking. My focus is on you as a leader. So I look at you and I look at your role in even making this communication possible in that way, in creating that nurturing culture, that adaptability you were talking about, resilience. And these are principles of knowledge mindfulness that I think you never really put a label on. But I'm looking at it right now and hearing you talk. And I'm always a big smile thinking, oh my God, Richard, you really have it as a knowledge mindful leader, right?
Thank you. Yeah, but
truly.
But what they did several years ago is they kicked me out. So about 8 years ago, when we figured out that, we had a very good management system functioning, but we found that perhaps having me in that leadership, in that CEO role, was actually a disadvantage for the establishment. Because, as you know, Laila, in the Arab world, it's a very patriarchal society. And usually when you have a certain amount of leverage and authority, it's very rare that you see people wanting to move away or to let go of it. And the issue with that is that when you do those things at a late stage, you'd be too young to step back in. So we went on the next chapter, which was how to get rid of me. And we were able to get rid of me. So what I did was I mentored the CEO, who's a lady from Tripoli, who now runs the hospital. For 8 years, I'm on the board. I do no day-to-day. I'm only as a board member.
Yeah.
The issue was, how do you move away? So I figured out that I had to go back to school. I had to learn a new skill set. So I went back to the States, to Boston, and studied. And I did a program where I learned how to run a private equity firm. And that allowed me to move away. The point that I'm trying to make is that why would I want to move away? It's precisely because of that mindset where you become the worst enemy of your institution. Because after 25 years of leading such a beautiful establishment, your willingness to take risk and your willingness to try and expand and do things becomes much less. Not the coattails of victory, right? I mean, I've done that. I took the hospital from a 45, 56 bed hospital to a 160 bed hospital. I took it from 150 employees to 800 employees. Your taste for taking risk and trying to push the needle even further becomes much harder. So the point was to try and move me out of the way and to bring in the new CEO. And with the new CEO, what was amazing was that we had said that your worst enemy is yourself. So if you're here to take care of the competition's actually you and the mirror. And your competition is actually my legacy. So if I was able to do all of that over these years, how are you going to be able to do better than what I've done? And what I don't know how to do are in these domains, are you going to be able to catch the slack on these fields? And touch wood, thank God, it was great. But it was also a professor who had given me a pointer, and it stuck to me till this day, is that when you do change, you have to do it when you're young enough to be able to step back in. Because the probability of we had looked at statistics, of hiring the right person, at the best case scenario would be between 30 and 40%. Because you might hire an amazing CEO, but it's a wartime CEO versus a growth CEO versus a settlement CEO. So it really depends on the cycle of the country and the area that you live in, and also on the maturity of the establishment that you're in. So if your chances are 35%, let's say, in the best case scenario, there's 65% chance that you're going to hire the wrong person. And if you do hire the wrong person, you're going to have to be able to be young enough to come back in and fix if there's any damage that was done, and also keep going with the change in the institutionalization of the establishment.
I really think these are great insights, Richard, but I want to go back to the VUCA world we're living in now in terms of the health sector, just focusing on that a little bit. In terms of the mistrust in the health sector right now, some of the headlines that we read lately in, let's say, New York Times, in the Financial Times, they talk about this fine line between making profit and really prioritizing the patient's care. I don't know how you do it in your hospital. Is it really a fine line? Is it a challenge to really keep that balance going on, making profits while having that in mind?
Healthcare establishments that I know of are profit-making. Okay, I don't know many healthcare facilities that don't make a profit unless they're mismanaged. That's a completely different. That's a completely different case. The biggest issue they have in the States, which we don't have as much here, is the misalignment of incentives. To succeed, you have to have everybody aligned on the same objective, and to have them aligned on the same objective, their incentives have to be the same. The issue in the States is the authority and the doctors have. Most caregivers, the lead is a doctor. Doctors, most of the time, are not very good businessmen. I'm sorry to all the doctors that are listening to us, but I mean, when it comes to business, when it comes not as independent businessmen, not as doctors went on to do, I don't know, some amazing startups or some amazing businesses. I'm talking as doctors in their profession. When you look at when you look at a surgeon or a cardiologist or a specialist, the way they manage their own business, which is their medicine, their giving, is a bit skewed in the States. And the alignment of incentives is very way off.
How?
There's an old saying, I mean, forgive me for saying this, there's a very old saying that when God was meeting with a surgeon and he asked him, do you know what the difference between God and a surgeon is? The surgeon says, no. God says, God knows he's not a surgeon. You know, when you have doctors that are super talented, the issue is they become very prima donna-ish. Their egos are grossly inflated, and you have a very hard time making them work as teams. And with medicine developing in such a way that it is today, it's all about, do you guys talk to each other? Do you share information? And then you get into that whole ego boundary where why would the cardiologist, need to talk to the ophthalmologist because of their water in the lungs, but the water came from the heart, not from the lungs. And you get into all of that. So you have to know how to police that. And being able to police that, I went off the subject. I'll come back to it in a second. But when you need...
No, just 1 second, Richard. But instead of policing, don't you think this comes from our learnings? You know, the way they have been taught, the way they have been given the information for so long. Do you think now it's the time to change all that, to rethink how to learn in a more interdisciplinary way, to kind of rethink the health sector in a more of a cooperation between different segments? Because for so long, we have focused on specializations, right? In our learnings, in our teachings. But I think more and more we're seeing now going maybe to another model of an interdisciplinary learning and teaching is maybe more effective in today's world.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the building blocks come from when they're being taught, but that also has to be followed up with the remuneration, with the way that they're paid later on. Because if you build that building block at the bottom, where you teach them how to play baseball. I mean, I always give them the example, you might be playing in left field and not do any play throughout the game, but when your team wins, you win all together, right? I mean, it's not about the person that's at the bat and batting. It's not about who scores the goal. It's about the whole team effort. So for sure, something has to be done in medical schools. You know, life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. A very famous lady here who heads the Beirut Marathon Association always says that, and it always stays in the back of my mind. You know, it's in the marathon is not something you can win by an individual effort. And you need a lot of help in order to be able to cross the finish line. So for sure, the issue starts with the building blocks at schools and the way we teach. Not many medical schools teach doctors business acumen, for example. At the end of the day, it's a money-making business, whether it's being a surgeon or being a dermatologist.
Yes.
So that has to be done, and it has to be followed up also with the insurance companies and the different social fabrics that will support what you taught them in practice. If you do the part one and you don't do the part two, human nature, you leave a horse to itself and it returns to galloping, right? I mean, it's a natural sense of thinking about themselves and not about the collective. That's human nature.
Yes.
So you need to do the building blocks, create the right mindset, and give them the right tool sets in schools. And then you have to continue it by having them remunerated and aligned and incentivized in a way that's... Look at the relationship that exists between a doctor and a nurse. It's a fear factor relationship. When there's a fear factor relationship, how much mistakes can happen. And some of the silliest mistakes in the world is the nurse doesn't wash her hands. The patient in intensive care dies because she took a bacteria from point A to point B. Do you want the nurse to work for you because she's scared, or do you want her to work for you because she loves it or he loves it, whether it's a female or a male, whatever the...
So how do you make them love it? I mean, if, let's say, you were to see something like this in the hospital, how would you change that? I feel you are very much a change agent in your thinking, in your learnings, and all that. But how do you teach all that to the people around you?
When I was still in management, we used to force each department with the doctors and the team, not only the nurses, but they're also caregivers, the lab technicians, the radiology, the housekeepers, and so on. We force every department to have at least 2-3 events hosted by the doctors for those workers. So they would create that kumbaya type of spirit. And of course, we do the big hospital thing where everybody gets together and everybody gets to bring their children, and et cetera, et cetera. We also instilled the concept of bringing your child to work to show them what you do. So even a housekeeper,
I like that,
can bring their child, and they meet the doctor and they meet the nurse, and it's humanizing. It's humanizing the workplace. It's make it much more friendly.
Yes.
Trying to break those boundaries is you do those with little steps. You can't really come and say I'm shaking the magic wand and everybody loves everyone. In Lebanon, in particular, with the latest problems that we're having, it's a lot of pressure that comes at you from different angles that were not usually there at the workforce. Humanizing and making the doctors and the nurses and the caregivers feel as if they're one family. We always say we treat you like family in the hospital.
You can feel it, right? I mean, you can't say it in words. You really need to walk the talk in terms of really genuinely feeling. So what you're saying is more like a human-centered leadership that really kind of bond people together, that you look at similarities and not differences. All this authoritative kind of leadership is more like in the backseat right now, right?
We say on the spectrum, there's fear and there's love. We prefer to lean towards love. However, we need to keep the fear factor there because we're dealing with people's lives, right?
Right.
You can't have somebody be carefree about, I'm supposed to give patient A his pills at 2 o'clock. Oh, I forgot about it. I'm going to give it to him at 4.
That doesn't...
it doesn't cut it. Right?
That doesn't work.
Doesn't cut it.
No.
Or a nurse forgets to wash her hands. I mean, that's not taken lightly. And those are come down very heavily. I think it was Jack Welch, and I know he's not very popular these days, but when he was at GE, he used to say that if you don't fire the bottom 20% of your employees, he wouldn't evaluate you as a CEO or a director, or he wouldn't want to sit with you. The issue with most establishments is that we give glory to the top stars. We forget that the majority are fence sitters that are observing, and we forget about getting rid of the bottom rank, the bottom feeders. The bottom feeders are destructive. And when you leave them and you don't hold them accountable, what happens with the 60% that's in the middle is they'll gravitate towards the bottom instead of moving towards the top. You have to be a bit, I don't want to sound authoritarian, but you have to be a bit severe with people that don't take their job seriously.
But I think you're having this really great balance between, like you said, when are you going to be authoritative and when is that caring, kindness comes out. It's really that fine line between the two. It's like the tango of really doing that, right? I always kind of think about it because, again, it goes back to the learnings. It goes back to how we were taught. And it's always that kind of one-dimensional thinking. It's either or, right? But why does it have to be either or? It's both. You need both. So yes, like you said, when do I use this? When is this? It's more like parenting, Richard, right? I mean, you're a father and you know, sometimes they need your love. Sometimes they need your authoritative father out there, right?
Yeah.
In so many ways.
Definitely.
Well, Richard, I think now would be the perfect time to stop. But coming up in the second part of our conversation with Richard Haykel, Richard is going to share with us what knowledge really means to him.
Knowledge for me is learning something that I don't know, that I have no clue what it's about, and not having the illusion of knowledge that I know.
You have been listening to the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Marouf. If you want to join the movement of knowledge mindfulness and shape the world of tomorrow, go to drlailamarouf.com. The Knowledge Mindfulness Porch is a production of Forbes Books.